How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tear Talk. Guys, today we're going to learn this. You won't learn the whole story from the report. And I will guarantee you this hits home. This is definitely a discussion I'm sure Frontline wants out there, especially for our people in administration. But I think it's also a good discussion for our administration, for our people to understand that the report is only a glimpse of what truly happened. And basically, we're going to break down a passage from a book that I have coming out in the very near future. It's called Warden Wisdom, and it's going to cover a lot of these topics. But passage 13 is titled, You Won't Learn the Whole Story from the Report. And I think, again, this is very beneficial for all parties that work in corrections. Now, guys, if you haven't, got to check out my books that are on the market. We got books on Amazon, Inmate Manipulation Decoded. We have Breaking Boundaries. We also have 2 new ebooks as well. We have Surviving Without a Mentor. So that's 100 deep cut tips for rookie correctional staff. And we also have Rank Before Ready, 100 subtle survival tips for new correctional leaders. And again, these will be published soon by the publisher. But right now I wanted to get the information out there. So they are ebooks and they're available for $9.99. And I do have another one coming out shortly. This is a very big book and it's called Warden Wisdom. And I think it's going to be over 700 pages, maybe even more. There's just a lot of information here because I'm trying to develop good perspectives. And guys, don't forget, I also have other books that are published through Blue 360 Media. And I just have a book that just came out March 30th that you could buy right in your hands. And it's for rookies. It's a daily guide for rookies. So I'd love to get that book out there. A lot of good information out there. All right, so let me get Joe. What up, Joe?
Hey, what's happening, brother?
Chilling. Hey, Joe, you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yes, sir. My name is Joe Pomponio. I'm a retired lieutenant from the Texas Department of Corrections of 29 years. Currently working as an assistant jail administrator in our local sheriff's department in the jail division and a panel member here for Tear Talk.
Yes, and we love having you. Joe, before we start the dialogue, this is a pretty good topic, right? You won't learn the whole story from the report because I'm sure there's a lot of people that really do lean on the report as an end all. Would you agree?
Yeah. Not the whole picture is not always told, in black and white. So what you get in a report can be kind of misleading at times and doesn't really tell the whole story.
Yes, and guys, what we're going to do now is we're going to kind of break down where the inconsistencies may be. But remember, the report is a glimpse. But even though it may document what, and we'll get to it, it really doesn't tell you the detailed hows or the why. The why is important. That's the intent. So what I'm going to do is I broke this down into sections. So we're going to go over each section, have a little discussion, move on to the next, and then just embrace this dialogue, see where it goes. Joe has not seen this passage yet. So Joe is going to just be reacting to what's being tossed out there. So passage 13, you won't learn the whole story from the report. So the tagline for this passage is, paper tells you what happened, people tell you why it mattered. I thought that was a good tagline. All right. There's a common trap in administration thinking that the documentation in front of you is the full picture, and it isn't. Reports serve a purpose. They're critical to accountability, transparency, and documentation. But if you're relying solely on what's written down, you're not just missing details, you're missing the soul of the situation. You're reading what someone did, but not understanding why they did it. You're seeing how a moment played out, but not how it felt when it happened. And that's the gap between action and intention. It's everything. Okay, so that's the little first part of that passage, a little bit of an introduction. What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, that's definitely true. The one thing you can't put in a report is emotion. You can put information, but you can't put emotion. So it's hard to really describe the entire situation in black and white and words, and being able to get the total informational, the total picture across.
Yeah, now, guys, obviously nowadays we have videos to complement the reports, but when you're reading the reports and you have gaps in what you feel are the whys or the hows, you got to be very careful that you don't start filling those gaps in yourself. Sometimes you could fill gaps in based on what you think you would have done, thinking that you understand the situation fully by reading the reports and seeing the video, when there could be little nuances that you don't know of, or you could already have bias towards the people that are doing it. So now you're starting to put in gaps without any understanding of what really happened. So yes, you may got the report and you got the video, but I think you got to be very careful of when you start reading the reports. I get you're going to watch the video. I get you may want to watch the video first. But you got to be very careful of when you start reading the report and you start having questions that you are unintentionally filling those gaps in, because you obviously may have experience with the individual that may not be so positive, or you may have experience that you yourself, well, I've worked this job. These are the things I would have done differently. Whoa, don't make that judgment yet, because you don't know. And I know that we do push for people that have experience to review these matters. But the experience the reason why we want the experience is so they can connect more with the individuals that are doing the job and not to hold it against them, at least at this point. I mean, you still got to invest in dialogue and discover their intent, but it's not for you to go in guns a-blazing. Because I have seen people, without even talking to individuals, say, well, that's weird they did it that way, because I would have done A, B, C, D, E. Well, hold on. You still don't know why they've done it. It's not in the report. Unfortunately, it's not a question that they thought to put in at that moment. So we need to figure that out before you already think you have the answer to that. Would you agree with that, Joe?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, no matter what your feelings are towards the person, the thing, the place, you got to be pretty unbiased in looking at these reports. You got to understand that these things happen for a reason, and obviously something happened to cause that reaction. So, you gotta kind of remove yourself from that situation, regardless of your experience, and, and understand, these things happen for a reason. They've happened to me, and I've had other people judge me for it. So, it's just one of the things where it's best to remove yourself and remove the bias from the situation, the person, regardless whether you had a positive interaction or a negative interaction with them. Obviously something happened which caused that reaction. So that's the real reason that, you need to be looking at the report.
Yeah. And guys, the reason why we're also doing this right now, this dialogue, also create the passage, is because we know that this is an intentional effort. So we're going to provide you information so you can guide yourself through this intentional effort, because you can't look at reports passively and then get caught up with your own biases. You have to really make the intentional effort. So when we go through this passage, we're going to kind of guide you with some questions that you should be asking yourself to ensure that you're actually understanding the gap, as opposed to filling in yourself with your own biases. Okay, so now the next part I have here, Joe, the next part of the passage, is reports create the frame, not the full painting. So over the years, I've read thousands of reports, and that makes sense. I've been in prison administration for over a decade now. Some were well written, some were a mess, some followed policy to the letter, but didn't connect emotionally to what actually happened. I've had cases where every report looked right on paper, proper sequence, appropriate language, neat formatting, but something felt off, and it usually started small. Maybe timelines didn't match. Description were vague or overly identical. Key actions were left out, things you expect someone to include if they truly lived through the moment. And that's when I knew the story wasn't complete. So we moved past the paper. We watched video footage, interview individuals, ask questions the reports didn't answer, and almost every time new clarity emerged. Sometimes the report was defensive. Sometimes it was written in haste. Sometimes it left things out because the person wasn't sure what to include, or they were still processing what they went through. That's the moment you realize reports create the frame, but the people involved paint the picture. And guys, I have a great book out there on report writing too that's published through Blue 360 Media. It covers a lot of this, but it's still good to revisit. But Joe, what's your thought on that? Because I think it does start, like, if when you start moving up, obviously, especially in the administrative level, which Joe is as well, you're looking for the narrative. So you're looking at how everything pieces together. And that's where inconsistencies start to happen. It may not be seen originally at the smaller picture, but definitely does evolve as it gets bigger, as the gaps get wider. And those inconsistencies could be small. They could be things that it may not really be that big, but it does open the door to something that may be something bigger. But what's your thought about reports creating the frame and not the full painting?
Yeah, I mean, your report is just a basic instructional, informational piece of paper that tells you, that gives you a basic guidance as to what happened in that situation. I was always taught, and I've always looked for reports that, had a legitimate timeline. That timelines are very important, because if you have a good timeline, you're able to create a report that gives the reviewer a good sequential picture of things that happen as they progressed. And, a lot of people, when they're writing the reports, don't keep a good timeline. They tend to refer to the video for it. And, that's where your small things start to come in play. And as the report progresses, you start noticing that, bigger things that are off, whether somebody grabbed somebody's left hand with the right hand or vice versa, things start to kind of fall apart there towards the end, because, for everybody's reports, they always remember the onset and the instant that it happened, but they don't remember. A lot of them have problems remembering the after, after we initially got the compliance, what happened then. That's where, a lot of reports start to kind of fall apart, whether we got medical, whether we had to call on-scene psych, or whether we had to report this to somebody. That's why, when you're creating a report, the first thing that should be in your mind is a good timeline, a good sequential timeline as to when things started. But, the reports are just a basic building block of information that give the reviewer an understanding as to, what happened, why it happened. The hows, that's where it falls on the person writing the report.
Yeah, and I got to say, so I've worked with supervisors that, once they get the report, and I thought this was actually a good thing. The first thing they would say was, okay, so we got an incident that we know happened. We have it on video, and we got some reports here. So at least we know the incident is documented at some level. Yeah. So that's how much of a blank slate they're starting with. And they know at that point, we're going to have to go through some muddy water. And it's not so much the muddy water of the emotions behind the incident, which we'll get to, but also the pressure when they're writing the report. You got a lieutenant on their ass. Hey, come on. I need that report. My shift's coming to an end. Come on. And then you have people that have this bias on how they're going to be judged for doing their job. So they don't mean to leave things out, but they're very careful on how they word things, because they're afraid that they're going to be held accountable because we're managing on extremes. We have this administrator who just wants to slam at people. And so there's a lot that's coming into play here. And I think when it comes to understanding the job at this level, I think people have to understand the emotions that not just go through the incident itself, but in the preparation of the report. Because one of the things it says here is it says the report could come off as defensive, because people may think that when I write the report, shoot, I got to defend what I've done, as opposed to really documenting what happened. So the report starts to lean to one side, or it was written in haste because it's pressure on it. You may have however amount, they say, oh, you got 24 hours to complete a report. Yeah, okay. The lieutenant's going to want that report almost immediately, because he wants to close that incident off and pass it up. So no one's waiting the 24 hours. So there is no cool down period. So the emotion is just coming over into the report writing. But I do agree with that one part. Well, I agree with all this, but I do agree that some people automatically, when they go to write a report, they're not so much documenting the incident. They're trying to be their own lawyer.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've done it myself, after a fresh use of force or something, I find myself, documenting and defending my actions versus actually writing the information, that needs to be put out there.
And you know what, Joe? It's all based on assumption too, because let's say you don't have trust with your administrator. Let's say for some reason, and we were talking about this, it's actually coming in another passage where you only see them during crisis moments. So basically either they're only coming down because they're being forced to come down, or rather it's performative, who knows. But when you don't have trust, you assume that the administrator or the team is going to look at the report in a certain way. So you start answering questions based on what you assume they're going to ask, that puts you in the defensive mode. And then you wind up breaking away from what really happened. And then unfortunately, the defensive mode of the report does seem to be that you could unfortunately be omitting things because you're more concerned about being judged towards the negative than actually having the situation being reviewed. Does that make sense, Joe? That assumption?
Yeah, it definitely does, because you're automatically thinking about, as you write the report, what are they thinking? How are they going to armchair quarterback this? What do I need to put in there to soothe their worries or their questions? Yeah. Been there, done that.
All right. So, and it's good for us to have this dialogue because maybe some people don't realize that their presence or their initial presence when they go to review it could be seen in that light. So now emotional intelligence matters. So I have the next section in this passage. Emotional intelligence is a requirement, not a bonus. So no one writes a report in a vacuum, especially when incidents involve conflict, danger, or high emotion. And sometimes we forget that. We expect staff to immediately document their actions with perfect clarity as if they weren't just involved in something stressful, fast-moving, or traumatic. But emotions distort memory, even in honest people. I have seen reports written by good staff that left out important details, not to deceive, but because they were still flooded with adrenaline, or because they were too close to the event and didn't know what to prioritize, or they were nervous about being judged. That's why emotional intelligence is so critical at the administrative level. You have to know the difference between a dishonest omission and an emotional oversight, an inconsistent timeline, and a frightened staff member trying to recall things under pressure, and a poorly written report, and a person who needs to process verbally before they can clarify it in writing. If you don't make that distinction, you'll treat every discrepancy as deceit, and you'll lose good people who just needed to be heard before being judged. There's a lot there, Joe. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, during a crisis incident, you got a lot of things going on besides your adrenaline. You got things happening at breakneck speeds. You got decisions you're trying to make at breakneck speeds. You're trying to give guidance at breakneck speeds. You got a video camera on top of you. You got video cameras around you, surveillance cameras. You got all these things on your mind. And when you sit down to write the report, it's integral that you give yourself some time to come down. Speaking from experience, there have been times where I've had to write reports right after the incident happened. And when that adrenaline's flowing, you have a flood of thoughts, flood of visions, flood of, trying to remember. You got timelines, you got administration on you. There's a lot of things that could get left out of the report if you don't have check of your emotions. The quicker you can slow yourself down mentally and just kind of take a breath and regroup and then look at the total picture. If you can give yourself time to look at the video surveillance and, kind of establish a timeline and go in a sequential order as things happen. And even if you write the best report, sometimes even the best report writers leave little things out. I mean, this isn't something that somebody jumps into right off the bat and has, expert experience. We've all written shitty reports, and, the corrections and the kickbacks and everything that we've done is what, caused us to take a better look at our reports and made us better report writers. So, being emotional at the time that you write a report is never a good thing. And like I said, speaking from experience, there have been times where I've left things out that were legitimate, that mattered. And, you're like, well, shit, I forgot that happened. It's important to give yourself some cool down time in order to, be able to write a good, complete report.
Yeah. And guys, I think there's also a misunderstanding here too, that me and Joe have actually just are kind of bringing to light. When you want to bring people that understand this, let's say use of force, high level incidents, whatever it is, a lot of people think that understanding is basically about the situation and what they would have done, because I need you to understand, what it's like to go through these situations. So the people that review the reports, sometimes instead of them really looking to understand basically the human element, they get more focused on the situation and they make it about what they would have done in those situations. And they totally remove the uniqueness of how, different people wear the uniform differently. If I may say, I mean, yes, there is some predictability in what we should value, what our principles are. Of course, obviously there's consistency with that. But we are still human under that uniform, and we could react to situations a bit differently or see situations a bit differently based on our own experiences and what we've been through. A threat to Joe may not be a threat to me, or vice versa. And, if you don't understand that person's perspective, then I don't think you're going to get a glimpse as to understanding why they did what they did. And that's why they filled the gap with what they would have done. And that's not why you're being brought to the table. I think, to be honest with you, people that should be brought to the table may not always have the specific knowledge of, what it's like to do a use of force, but they should have a connection to the human element. So yes, I want a balance of both. I want people that know the job, know the details, because obviously there's some policy stuff here. But I also want people that aren't so defined by policy that it removes the human element of decision making. So there is a balance. I mean, I could flood the table with people that know policy to a T, and that's great. And we'll look at everything and see how it aligns. But I still got to know why that person did it, and I need someone to connect to the human side, the human side of that decision making process. Because at one point, I will tell you this, and I know this is true, especially in use of forces. When you're committing to a use of force at first, and that person's coming at you, it's not about policy or procedure. It's about survival. What do I got to do to protect myself first before I even think about the agency, before I even think about, what my job role is? I haven't controlled the situation. So I need someone to not so much focus on policy at the very beginning, but focus on me and my understanding of the situation. And that, to me, is extremely beneficial, because you can get a lot of people that are very blinded by policy. And these are the people that we may think we want in those positions to review. And to some point, yes, but not to be the sole contributor. But with that said, they're so blind by it that they're far removed. They could be able to quote policy line by line by line, but you tell them how to apply it during a stressful moment, and they may not know. So I want to show guys that there's a connection. There is, yes, the understanding of what needs to be done 100% in a perfect world. But then there's also the human element. I know, Joe, when you reviewed it, you said you would do it this way. But simple thing, Joe, is Anthony isn't you. Anthony isn't you. So you gave me a little bit of a guideline, a little bit of a guardrail, but I got to see how things maneuver. And I really got to talk to Anthony, because, again, thank you for the information. Thank you for giving me the parameters of where I got to work into, so I know, where the outliers are, and I don't want to cross into that. But there's a lot of muddy water in the middle, and I'm not going to get that from what Joe would have chose to done in the moment. I'm going to get it from what Anthony did, because Anthony lived it, breathed it, didn't have the knowledge that you now have, and he's figuring out in the moment while at the same time trying to resolve the situation. Imagine how complicated that is, trying to deal with unknowns and trying to bring a conclusion to it. Would you agree with that, Joe? Does that make sense?
Yeah, a lot of the times that we write these reports, there's a lot of people who are quick to armchair quarterback. This is what I would have done. That's what I would have done. I would have done this way. You don't know what the hell you would have done unless you were in that situation at that time. It's easy to sit back and armchair quarterback somebody else for what they do, because they wrote 3/4 of a great report and 1/4 of it was details that were left out, or things that were missing that should have been there. You got to understand that report writing after an incident it's not automatic. It's not a robotic action. It's every person experiences different emotions when they're going through uses of forces. Some can keep their cool, some get angry. Some, may get, have a sense of being scared for their staff. There's a whole plethora of things going on at this moment. And, to armchair quarterback somebody, for what they did or who they are, it's insignificant. A lot of people go through these situations, and, to this day, there's times where I have to write reports after something has happened, and there's something. It might have been something on the video that I missed. That the sheriff will say, "Hey, I seen this on the video. What about that part?" I didn't even see that part. Let me go back and look again. It's going to happen. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's a robot. Nobody's a machine when it comes to these reports, and that's the one thing that a lot of these reviewers, don't keep in mind. And, sometimes these reports go to people that don't have experience in this shit. Never step foot on a freaking unit. They sit in a cubicle somewhere reviewing these use of force reports and making the decisions on whether they're good, bad, indifferent, whatever.
Yeah, Joe, you're right. And you know what's funny? I do feel it's a fine balance too, because I know a lot of people may think that, you know what, you got to get more people on it that have dealt with it and lived it. And that's great. But but I want to mention something too, just to be objective. And again, right or wrong, it's not about being right or wrong, but just to put a thought out there real quick. Sometimes they could be our enemy too, because they will embrace the fact that they're an expert or be considered an expert. And then that title becomes what they want. And they will literally struggle with someone when, without knowing the facts, when they get challenged, they will stick to their guns. They'll stick to being the expert, and they'll lean on their title that I'm the expert. I'm the one at this table, and I know the policy. I know the procedure. Well, at the end of the day, maybe you are an expert at, a perfect world where, this policy would have applied perfectly. But are you an expert at Joe, who went through it? Do you understand maybe the choices he made? Are you an expert on Anthony? He was also on the team that went through it. No. So how do you become that expert? Is you got to talk to him. You got to see what their perspective was and not try to have a decision that could affect their jobs made because you want to solely lean on the fact that you're an expert and you understand policy and procedure. Now, granted, obviously there are moments where you just can see it. I get it. And I'm not talking about moments where it's so obvious that there's excessive force or violation of policy. I'm talking about the interpretation of the gray. That's all I'm saying. A lot of use of forces are not pretty. We know that. And there's a lot of gray. And you got to be very careful of how you interpret the gray, because sometimes that gray it may have went outside of policy or procedure, but let's understand what happened here. It doesn't mean it's a violation if it went outside of policy and procedure. It may mean that policy and procedure may have to be revisited. But sometimes you get people that are so stuck in policy and procedure that they don't know how to look to the left or right. They don't. And what happens here is when it comes to the gray, they get confused. So they lean back on one, I'm the expert on this. And two, this is what policy and procedure says. I get it. But there's a why here. And you keep on leaning on policy and procedure. So my argument would be, well, what about if the why that I need can't be answered through that and only could be answered through the people that did it? And then that causes us to now go back and look at policy because we may have a nuance here. So yeah, I love it. I think it's needed, but I still feel there's a balance as long as we're bringing people to the table that can balance the art of decision-making under stress, the art of decision-making when, you're in survival mode, the art of decision-making when you don't have all the information, but you have to move in to slow things down, to gain some control, because that's the thing, guys. It's when you're trying to gain control in chaos. There's no rules here, even though you're going to try your best to go ahead and try to model what policy and procedure is. You're bringing things back to policy and procedure. But to be honest with you, as you're thinking of things through the moment, if you're going to sit there and try to hold everything down to a piece of paper and pen, and this is the only things that they can choose from to make that attempt, you're going to wind up putting them at risk. You need discretionary effort, and the only way you could truly understand discretionary effort, especially because discretionary effort may lie outside of policy and procedure, not in violation, but just lie outside policy and procedures. You got to ask the person who employed it. You have to. You can't be blinded by so much of policy and procedure that you automatically think that you understand what that person was thinking of in the moment, because here's another thing, Joe, I'm sure you would agree. Consequences matter. I get it. But we can't control the outcome. We can only control our intent going in. So maybe I had a bad outcome and you want to judge me based on the outcome without knowing my intent, because if you would have went by policy and this, yeah, that's great. You know the answers to what already happened. So your decision making is a lot different than mine. You have to take into account, I'm trying to figure it out. So my first effort is, how do I slow things down? Not solve the matter. Because you're looking at it, reading the reports, thinking that initially I'm trying to solve the matter. And I'm not trying to solve the matter at first. I don't even know what the hell's going on right now. I'm trying to slow things down. So my first instinct may not be the resolution that you're looking for, because I don't know what I'm walking into. Yeah. So my first instinct is to slow things down. Does that make sense, Joe? Have you been through that? Yeah. Am I hitting things good or no?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have some people that review these reports out there that lean on their title so bad they're intentionally looking for violations instead of being biased to the situation. You look at the fact that I had a use of force on an inmate who had a weapon, and ultimately his arm got broke trying to secure the weapon. You know, and to the reviewer, they're just looking at the inmate has a broken arm. They're not looking at as to why, you know, the whole situation happened to begin with. So, you know, you have some people who can look at reports biasly and understand the situation. And then you have the people who don't quite have the experiences, but they were hired to review these things and do the jobs, and or they, you know, consider themselves experts. And, you know, instead of being biased, they go into these reports and look at these situations with the intent to find violations right off the bat. They're not looking at the situation in its totality.
I agree with that. And this was a good little break into that. We went a little, well, it's still within the topic. So the next part I have, that's why I write these passages, so we can have discussions like this. So if you only rely on the report, let me just make sure I did the, hold on. No, sorry. I missed one. Wait, let me back up for a second, guys. Sorry about that. But so I don't have to write it in, but the last part we did just now was emotional intelligence. Sorry, we got so into that dialogue that we kind of crossed into the next part. So I do want to add it in, guys, so it separates well, but it's called reading the report isn't enough. You have to understand the moment. Man, me and Joe we do what we do, and then we kind of jumped into the next one, which is fine. It's I thought we covered it. I got confused, but we didn't actually yet. Well, at least not from the passage point. So reading the report isn't enough. You have to understand the moment. One of the first things I tell newer administrators is this. It's different going through something than reviewing it after the fact. When you're reviewing a report, you already know the outcome. You have hindsight. You see the full board. You have time to slow down, analyze, connect dots. But the staff member writing that report, they didn't have that luxury in the moment. They were reacting, making decisions under stress, processing things in real time with limited context, and trying to survive, not just physically, but professionally. So when you read a report, you have to remove hindsight bias. You have to ask yourself, what did they know in the moment? What were they trying to accomplish? That was one of the things I mentioned. You know, the people that review it may look at to see that you're trying to put an end all to the situation the moment you came in, and it's not. It's a process of progressive control. So I'm not trying to end it yet. I'm trying to figure it out, and maybe my first attempt is to slow things down. So what is someone trying to accomplish moment by moment? There's going to be different things that you're trying to accomplish to ultimately bring things to the end result. And were they operating within the limits of their training, their stress level, or their available support? And look at that. That is definitely something maybe, Joe, we could revisit is, were they operating within the limits of their training, their stress level, their available support? What a great question if you're reviewing a report to try to discern from someone when you're communicating them. Were they limited by what policy says? So let's go from there. Maybe you could tell me where policy was ineffective by knowing policy and what you had to branch out of. Or was there stress? Did you not know what was happening? When the inmate came at you, it was more about defending yourself, and this is why it went that way. Or the support. You know, well, maybe I didn't originally call a code right away because I knew my backup team wouldn't be ready, so I engaged immediately to protect the person from killing themselves or whatever it is. I mean, where was the support? Because that could determine what your actions would be too. And a report can tell you what they did, but a conversation, an honest one, can tell you why. That's where leadership shows up, not just reviewing paper, but reaching people. What's your thought there, Joe? Especially when I said, were they operating within the limits of their training, their stress level, their available reports? I want to mention something. The reason why I brought up the suicide thing is I've seen an incident where an inmate was playing the game, but looked like he was going to be successful, and the officer was calling the code, but there wasn't enough of a backup. They were already responding to another emergency situation where there was an inmate being assaulted. So yes, there is a preservation of life, but one is a victim and one is causing his own concern. So the attempted suicide became secondary. The assault became primary. And then what happened was the officer's waiting for the response and winds up jumping in and pulling out the inmate, which was a huge risk because they opened up the door without backup. But you would, someone on paper would only see the policy violation, but when you go to talk to him, you'll hear the mindset of why he jumped in. He didn't jump in to be foolish. He saw somebody trying to hurt themselves, and his motivation was to save that inmate's life. And at that point there, even though he violated policy became an obstacle for him to do that. So now you have the human impulse. So what happened was policies were changed to eliminate the impulse that causes a break in a policy. So basically is, well, if you didn't want that person to go in, why are they given the key if they got to wait for backup? Why ain't the key being brought to the backup? Why can't the backup bring in? This way it eliminates the impulse of that person to want to go in and save the life of that individual. That's why I brought that, if that makes sense. But what's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, the one thing, when we write these reports, the one thing that we take for granted and we don't really think about is, at some point these reports may land on somebody's desk outside the agency that has no clue as to what we do on a daily basis. They don't understand the decisions we make, why we make them, and you brought up the suicide thing. I can remember, being deposed one time by a lawyer because an officer, was dealing with an inmate at the same time that another incident was happening. There was no backup available. The inmate was threatening to commit suicide. He had the noose around his neck, but he was just carrying the other end around. He wasn't tied off to anything. And he kind of made a motion like he was going to go towards his vent and tie it off to the bars. And as he did that, because the officer still didn't have no backup, but yet he was trying to preserve this inmate's life and stop him from taking his life, he utilized his chemical agents and sprayed the offender while he still had the noose on his neck, but he wasn't tied off to the other end. So, you fast forward 6 months down the road, an inmate being an inmate, they file grievances, lawsuits, all this kind of bullshit, even after we saved his life. And, the lawyers are looking out, well, why the hell would you spray somebody that had a noose around his neck? Because he wasn't tied off the other end. I had no backup, and I felt I had to do something to preserve his life. At this time, this was something that wasn't even in the policy. There was no definition as to suicidal inmates and utilization of chemical agents. There was nothing in there that said that we could or could not use chemical agents to preserve life during a suicidal moment. But the officer, and I'll give him credit. It was quick thinking. He utilized his chemical agents for that. So it's something that, depending on how the report's written, who's reading a report, it doesn't tell the tale. All the tale says is that the inmate had a noose around his neck and was attempting to tie off. So I utilized my chemical agents on him. Until you actually see the video and actually see the confrontation between the officer and the inmate and actually watch how well this officer kept his cool up until that point. The report, you couldn't put that kind of description. You couldn't put that kind of emotion into a report to make people outside the agency understand that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well said. And guys, remember, OC is a de-escalation. So the officer just has to be able to explain it and how it was utilized. And you're right, you're not going to get that through just reading the report. I'm trying to control the situation before I can control the individual. So if that individual is getting ready to jump, the situation means he's going to hurt himself. So I want to control this. What's the best way? I'm going to OC him. That will, protect me as well. So then when I go in, I have a bit of an advantage. Or when the team goes in, we have a bit of an advantage. All right, so the next part I got, Joe, is if you only rely on the report, you risk making the wrong call. Too often leadership reads the documents, checks for compliance, and moves on. But here's what gets lost: the intent behind the decision, the emotional weight someone carried during the event, the context that shaped their actions, context that may not appear in the wording, the missed opportunities for coaching, support, or redirection, and the deeper cultural cues that could signal burnout, frustration, or team conflict. Now, remember, guys, these aren't excuses. These are justifications. I want people to be wary of that. And you can kind of know it when you kind of know your employees. I can pretty much know my employees to some extent, and I can know, again, still exhausted effort, if they're leading me down a path full of excuses or if they're telling me justifications. Because somewhere along the line, through our moments, we built relationships where there's trust that's exchanged on both sides. So you can kind of know where someone's steering you. If you only rely on the report, you treat incidents as black and white, snapshots instead of dynamic living moments, And that's a dangerous mistake because corrections is anything but black and white. It's complex. You risk disciplining someone unfairly, or worse, you miss an opportunity to support someone who needs help. You also risk rewarding someone who played it safe on paper, but was ineffective in practice. Because let's be honest, some people know how to write a report better than they know how to do the job. Wait, let me say, Joe, I'm surprised your eyebrows didn't lift on that one. So I'm going to read that again. And then I expect a more heartfelt response because that hit me. Because as you're putting things together, I'm like, you know what? That is 100% true, and I'm putting that down. Because let's be honest, some people know how to write a report better than they know how to do the job. And you want to know why that is? Because they know how to play lawyer.
Yep.
When they're writing those reports. Joe, a lot there, Joe.
Yep. Yeah, you got the people that can write exceptional reports right off the bat, but if you put them in an incident, they couldn't lead a horse to fresh water. And you have those people, and like I said, every person needs to understand their employees and know how to utilize them. You utilize your report writers, you utilize your command leaders, you utilize your tactical people. But yeah, when you're relying just on a report itself, just because you can write a good report does not mean that you understand what happened or can apply, the basics and the knowledge and the policies and the procedures. You definitely have those people out there for sure.
Yeah. And guys, you know what? It's funny because, this is the reason why I wanted to have this dialogue is just there are people that get disciplined unfairly. I agree with that. And there are also moments where it could be a learning moment, but now you ruined it because you went strict to disciplining someone without understanding the choice that they made. Because maybe the intent was good, but there could have been other opportunities. And now you can maybe take advantage of this and make it a coachable moment. Because for me, I've always tried to teach people to go beyond the symptom. Because obviously symptoms can be so unique, but if you can give them a solid foundation, that could give them a lot of strength to move forward with stronger decision making. Because if you're looking to react to every symptom, because that's the truth, it's going to be a reaction. Symptoms could vary, but if you try to find a way to safely put these things under certain umbrellas, if that makes sense, then you start to respond because you're attacking the foundation. And I think you're going to find a lot of similarity with foundational responses than you would symptomatic reactions. I agree with that. I think that, as I said, symptoms on the surface could vary and show up in many different angles. But if you get a good supervisor that comes in, they could look at that moment and within a second get right down to the bottom of it. They just know exactly where the root is of it all. And their approach is powerful. Their approach is powerful because no matter how many different symptoms are coming across, they know the root of the problem. And I think that's where it gives us stronger options and makes the situation a bit less confusing. I've also seen supervisors that are so focused on the symptoms that they're running around and being controlled by the situation, as opposed to someone coming in and slowing it down by getting right to the root. So you could spend all your time breaking branches, or you could chop off the tree, chop down the tree. Does that make sense, Joe? I mean, is that I think a good supervisor, if they have time, guys, obviously there are emergency situations, but if there's time, they could discern, and their approach could be more powerful because they've been there and done it, and they know where the root is of the problem. So they put all their energy towards the root and totally cut down the tree.
Yeah, I mean, you're always looking for somebody who can come in and assess a situation and slow it down versus speed it up. Being able to deal with a situation and know what the root cause is just because of your experiences. That gives you the tactical advantage of slowing things down, keeping people from getting hurt, keeping people from utilizing chemical agents or having to use of force or suiting up a 5-man team for a cell extraction. You have those supervisors out there that are good at what they do. They're good at their verbal judo. They're good at their de-escalation tactics. And you have some supervisors out there that, I don't give a fuck why it happened. I'm coming to get his ass, and it's I'm not really saying it's a lesser of two evils. But one usually has a better outcome than the other.
Right. True. And now I got the next part. Let's see. So now I have what reports doesn't tell you matters most. Now, mind you guys, this is all one passage. So there's a lot of, that's why the book is so big. There's 100 of these passages, but they're breakdown. You could read a part of a passage a day at lineup and just discuss, like we're doing. So what report doesn't tell, what the report doesn't tell you matters most. A report won't tell you how close someone was to their breaking point. A report won't tell you whether a team worked well together or barely held it together. A report won't tell you if a misstep was due to poor judgment or sheer exhaustion. A report won't tell you whether a supervisor was supportive or absent. A report won't tell you what someone was thinking in the moments before they acted. What someone was thinking in the moments before they acted. Now, those answers live in conversation, in body language, in tone of voice, in the subtle moments when someone explains their reasoning and you can feel the conflict behind their eyes. Sometimes the most important thing you can do after reading a report is to sit down and talk to the person who wrote it, not just to verify facts, but to understand them. That's where leadership becomes personal, and that's where better decisions are made. What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, and one more thing reports, won't tell you is, whether or not the system or, the situation itself was the person trying to de-escalate it or solve it, or did they actually instigate it? It's something else that, you don't see in reports. People won't give themselves up easily until you actually view the video. I've had instances where officers kind of instigated them into a use of force. And I've had officers that, just had the legitimate use of force as they were spontaneous or whatever. But, when you get reports, the initial confrontation is normally not in there. What led to it? Was it a verbal altercation that led to a physical altercation? I've had instances where I found that after the fact by reviewing video footage and audio where, they verbally instigated that, situation into happening, but it wasn't in the report. So, what is in the report, may be factual, but there's sometimes there are things that are left out of the report that matter. It matters to the situation. It matters to the outcome. It matters to the why.
And guys, by the way, obviously people write the report under their own perspective, and then you got to piece things together. That's where, people at the higher level, they're trying to create a narrative that makes sense. And I truly do think you get a glimpse from the video, you get a glimpse from the report, but you got to get to know who the author is, because the author is going to have a reason of why it was written in a certain way, and that can provide clarity that's just not seen on the report, especially if some people in defensive mode. Sometimes when people get in defensive mode, you may have to discern their intent by talking to them, because again, I may be trying to hide it because I'm more concerned about me getting in trouble. And guys, this actually goes into cultures that lean through fear. You got leadership sometimes that believe fear is respect, and it's not. And then what happens here is people do write reports, and again, they should still be held accountable. But with that said, you still want to create an environment where it's easy for them to note vulnerabilities, note concerns, as opposed to going ahead and hiding under the rug. I mean, you could have people that are honest and they'll put small things down and you can catch it before it evolves into something bigger. But then you get people that are so concerned about leadership punishing them that they hide the smaller concerns that we should be able to pick up, because the first thing that fails, especially when it comes to these situations, are the basics. So people will start hiding them, and then you don't realize it's anything bad's happening until something explodes. And then it's like, well, we got to go after the people because they weren't doing the basics. Well, wow. Is there a reason why they weren't telling you this? Because it looks like there's a trust concern too. Yeah, we'll still hold them accountable, but I want to ask them why they're not saying anything. Why did we get to this point where it exploded? Because the basics is their survival. So how do we get to a point where there are concerns, but no one's admitting these vulnerabilities? Do we lead a culture of communication and maybe some level of investment, or do we lead a culture through fear where people just learn to shut up? Because what I've learned in corrections is silence is not always good. In this job, you expect complaints. You do. You expect things. You expect concerns. And when you're not hearing them, sometimes you have to look inwards and look at yourself. Am I doing something wrong? Because these incidents are happening for me not to get any feedback. That's crazy. All right, so last part I got it. Well, there's two parts here. Is all right. So what should we tell new administrators? Okay, so just in general, reports matter, but they're not gospel. They're the starting point, the template, the outline. They're necessary, but they're not complete. If you want to lead well, don't stop with the paper. Ask questions, invite clarity, dig into the context. Use emotional intelligence to bridge the gap between what happened and why it happened. Because if you only judge the action, you miss the person. And in corrections, if you miss the person, you miss everything. So the key insight here for this, Joe, is reports offer structure, but not substance. They tell you what happened, not how it happened or why. Leadership requires emotional intelligence, curiosity, and the willingness to go beyond documentation. By connecting with the people behind the reports, you make better decisions, support your staff more effectively, and ensure that context, not just content, guides your judgment. So what would you tell a new administrator? Would it be related to what I just said?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have questions, ask the people involved. Don't go by, reading one statement and then having questions, and you read another statement and you have more questions. Ask the people who are involved. They can give you clarity into the situation as to why things happen. That'll give you a better understanding. All it takes is a simple conversation. Like I had one that reported at my desk on a use of force. They had a use of force on a guy in a wheelchair. They used chemical agents on them, and the first thought in my mind was, how the fuck do you spray somebody who's in a wheelchair? Why just move his ass out of the way? And, come to find out after talking with the folks that the officer that actually had the use of force and sprayed this guy was trying to push him out of the way, but the guy kept trying to bite him. And he had no backup at the time. So his only thought process was, I'll give him a spray of chemical agents to keep him busy long enough for me to get him out of the way. And, it's just one of those things that, you read something right off the bat and your brain's like, what the hell? And you're looking at the reports and you're not seeing any clarification in any of these reports. Talk to the people. Talk to them, ask them, what was in your mind when this happened? What was going on? What led you to do this? And 9 times out of 10, they'll give you a better understanding than what the report you're reading is.
Yeah. And guys, I think me and Joe are going to have more of these discussions. I'm also going to do more discussions with Russ on some tips for rookies, as well as being thrown into rank, because we're trying to fill the gap. I think there's a lot of role models, as I said, that are leaving. So I'm trying to give advice that isn't so standard, just more nuanced, more applicable, more practical. This is me and Joe's second discussion on this. So I think I have another one set up for next week already. And they're building off these dialogues here. Maybe one day we could do classes or shows classes or appearances based on some of the lessons on this book. That will be the goal when I retire. I already have an offer right now that I'm going to try to get Joe and Russ in. It's going to be out in Colorado. So we're going to be kind of mimicking some of these lessons, but just really not from a PowerPoint. We're just going to break through the passages and just hold real good discussions so we can learn in the process, give our perspective, listen what the audience says, and just create a good dialogue where we just have some coffee, talk about shop, and listen more than doing the talking ourselves. Try to gauge guidance, if you will, if people are willing to get involved. Lessons like this are definitely a two-way discussion or dialogue, because you can give out the lesson, but they have to apply it. So I think when you do the discussion, they find meaning, and that meaning gives a motivation to now apply what takes courage to do. I'm applying something different into a world that I've been so used to doing it this way. So this is disrupting it, removing the person from the comfortability of what they've always done, and then giving them the courage to take investment and trying something new. And that comes on the back end of discussion. How do we give you something new, and we can, with it, provide some level of ownership? And that's where you got to have the courage to provide a lesson and prepare for the kickback. Because if this is something that you're willing to do yourself, then you should have no problem defending it no matter what somebody says. That's the key. And by the way, if it doesn't hold the weight through those challenges, then maybe it's not the right lesson. Hey, Joe, anything you'd like to say in closing, sir?
Yeah, when it comes to reports, for the people reviewing these reports, don't take them at face value. Understand that there's some underlying causes, underlying things that may or may not been, either intentionally or accidentally, omitted from the report that might give you a better understanding as to what took place. Don't be so quick to rush to judgment. Understand the situation. If it was a policy violation, it was a policy violation. If it was blatant, it was blatant. If there was some sort of justification that was not added to there, interview the people. Come to try to understand. Give yourself a better picture. You got to realize that most of these people writing these reports don't have the luxury of time. They have other things going on. I know as a lieutenant, time was not a luxury I fucking had. I had chow to feed. I had a building to run. I had a building schedule to adhere to. I may have had 3 other reports I had to write on top of this one. So understand that the people that are writing these reports are already under pressure to begin with. And, sometimes things get left out, not intentionally, accidentally. And just, understand the situation, understand the person, understand the time frame, understand the concept. For the people writing reports, try to be as detailed as you possibly can when writing these reports. For the simple reason, not because you want to keep the lieutenant, the captain, the major, the warden happy with a good report. One thing you got to understand about these reports is at some point in your career, you're going to have a report that's going to land outside your agency into somebody's hands, whether it be a lawyer, whether it be a judge, whether it be sometimes they land in the newspapers or the news media because the open records request them. Understand that, these reports you write are important. Make sure you got the who, what, when, where, why, and what happened in there. A good professional report will, sometimes land outside the scope of our own people. And, that's a lot of things. That's one of the things that a lot of us tend to forget when we're writing these reports. We just take for granted it's going to stay in-house. So just make sure that you are writing a good, thorough report when you're writing these.
Yeah, and guys, if you haven't, get your hands on this book. Let me just show it real quick on the larger screen, if you don't mind, Joe. Right here, Effective Report, Ryan. I published this through Blue 360. There's so much insight here. I believe also at the end of each chapter, because there's a lot here. Guys, it covers a lot, just in my OCD of it all. I think I do have, I think Joe and Russ have quotes at the end of each chapter here that we worked on when we put this book together. And again, I have the rookie book that's out now. You got to check out these ebooks. This book that we're reading from now will be out probably in a couple of weeks. I'm still working on it. It's a little bit of work. I will tell you the good thing about ChatGPT is when you go to put a book together, it will help you with the structure, and then it will give you the questions that you have to answer. So as I do each passage, it asks me 5 or 6 questions. I answer the questions, and then it formats it into something that's truly relatable. So it builds from your own experiences, basically as if I'm being interviewed. And then it puts it together and gets the thought out there. And it's such a time saver. So you're able to produce more information, but you still take ownership of it because it's going from how you answer the questions and then providing balance. Then you read it and then make some adjustments and then go back. And it really does come out to be as detailed as that one passage is. It's not the initial passage it first sends you. I mean, you got to, answer them. So they give you like 5. I've asked for 5 questions for each passage. And, it's a great process because in progress, I'm also learning a lot as well. So, and I know they say that AI. Well, the funny thing is people are using it. So either I fall behind the times or try to take advantage of these moments and put out as much information as I can. As always, guys, the show is Tear Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify every time I post a video. Stay safe.